row. So
everybody. So we'll declare it live. I have no interface to see that. We're just going to have to pretend. I'm going to have to pretend. So, hello, everybody. It's Barbara Tien, and here I am with my wonderful guest, Annette Gendler, joining us this time on one of our little Substack Live programs to dive in, to just have conversations. Today, I asked Annette here to talk a little bit about her wonderful book about writing compelling family stories. I can dig around to go grab the book, which is naturally parked right behind my monitor because that's how we roll. But tell me a little bit, Jeanette. I mean, Annette, how did you? What triggered you to write this book? You've been teaching classes on writing?
yes, so I got an MFA in creative writing 2005. I graduated in 2007, and I actually got like the dream writing teaching job, like right in between. I didn't even have my MFA yet, and I pretty quickly specialized in teaching memoir. And at the same time, my MFA thesis was uh, the book that eventually became this,
Uh-huh. Thank you.
Jumping Over Shadows,
Uh-huh.
which is really based on, for a large part, on my family history. Mainly, the impetus for the book is that my love story with my husband, a German woman falling in love with a Jewish man, had already happened in the family, and I was very conscious of that. Because that family story happened during World War II, during the Holocaust, so that was in the Czech Republic, so that was quite difficult. And so I was very conscious of that the oddity of that constellation happening again. I'm like, what's up with that? So I sort of started that was my beginning of digging into the family history beyond, the stories that my grandmother told me, but to really look at what happened, what was the sequence of events. And thankfully, my grandfather left what he called his memoirs. My grandfather was mainly a poet, and he wrote plays for the German language radio station in Prague. So he was a very um, language person and a writer. So I had good material to draw from. And he, in his memoirs, tried to work out partly what had happened with his sister,
Mm.
who had been married to a Jew, and they lived in the same sort of smaller city that then ended up becoming the capital of that part of Czechoslovakia that fell under Nazi rule in the beginning, the Sudetenland. So it was a very uncomfortable situation because my grandfather was also a social democrat, so he was and he had served on the city council in that town, so he was not of the right political affiliation at the time. So anyway, it was a very dramatic story, and I started digging into that, and so that was in the end became Jumping Over Shadows, and it juxtaposes my story and how my husband and I sort of built our life with the story of the past, and it's a bit redemptive. Anyway, um, so then I started. The book came out in 2017, and I started, as one does, doing publicity. And since I was a teacher, I thought about giving workshops, and very quickly, when I was talking to different people, about doing events, uh, somebody asked me, well, how did you do this? Like, how did you make a, a story that people will actually read out of your family history, out of all the materials that you had? And I got that question more than one time. So I thought to myself, well, maybe I should give a workshop around that. And that ended up being my sort of very successful publicity stunt. I gave a lot
Mhm.
of, worldwide. I gave some in Israel. I did them all over the United States. So, and then I kept getting the question as I was doing all these workshops from people who wanted to attend but couldn't, asking me, well, don't you have any materials from this workshop? And I got that question one too many times to where I thought, here's the
Hmm.
market telling you what it wants, what you could contribute. So I ended up creating this book, How to Write Compelling Stories from Family History. Um, and believe it or not, even though I knew what I was talking about and I had, this very established workshop, it's very hard to put I have an organic way of teaching.
Mhm.
And my workshops, of course I have a little syllabus of what I present, but it's pretty lean. It's usually all about interacting with the people who are in the workshop and what they bring to it.
Right.
And so I'm like, so it's a very organic thing. I thought of sort of a circle, but a book is a straight line. You have to fit your material into bullet points. It has to be one, two, three, four, five. There have to be chapters. And I had a very hard time putting that together. In the end, what helped me, and you will probably appreciate that as a tech person, was the Scrivener software,
Mhm.
which is not like I wrote my entire first book on Word, and I was like, what do you need Scrivener for? Well, I discovered I needed Scrivener because in that system, unlike Word, you can move chapters around. So you can look at your table of contents and you can go, like that chapter really goes with this. It should follow and you can just push it up.
Mm.
Versus in Word, you got to search, then you got to cut and paste. You never see the whole
Yeah.
product, in
Yeah.
you don't have the outline basically visual, and you can't
Mhm.
move it.
Mhm.
So that's how Scrivener helped me to finally create this book. And it's been my of the three books that I've put out into the world, it's been my bestseller because it helps people, which I'm very happy about.
There's a distinct pattern you've repeated here, and I'll just go ahead and call it out. And that is that your first memoir started with an exploration of yourself, and then you realized the pattern of the story you could tell about someone else in the family, and that needed to be told first. So you did that. In your courses, you were starting with the self of the other people that you're talking to. You talk about how it's always an interactive, organic, but a book is linear and structured. Well, linear,
Mm,
it's the linearity and the circularity that is sticking with me because
mm.
I have trouble with that. I am not
Welcome.
linear.
It's it is. It's quite difficult. And that's also part of what I think makes it so hard to write any story from family history. So when I actually, my Jumping Over Shadows, my memoir, actually began in the past. It didn't begin with my story
Mhm.
because I was fired up about finding out what happened to my family, to my great aunt, to my great uncle, how that all
Mystery.
went down. That was like, and it's, high drama, World War II, Holocaust, all that. Um, and it had huge impact on how my family sort of developed after the war. So I was really interested in that. And then, it was my master's thesis. So I presented basically a series of essays about the story of the past. And then one of my thesis advisors, who was actually a fiction writer, whom I had deliberately chosen, even though I was majoring in nonfiction, because I wanted to make sure that I was presenting an interesting story. And he said, well, this is all fine and nice, but who cares? You really need to put how this impacted you and how this influenced your love story. That needs to be in there. And I'm like, oh no, really? Like, you want me to write my own love story? How the hell am I going to do that? So then I circled that wagon for a while because I really didn't want to write that. But it's also good high drama. So not as high drama as the story of the past, but still. And I ended up, I was lucky enough, I got a writer's residency at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts because this was still in a phase of my life where I had three kids at home. And, it was very hard to sort of live with piece of a body of work, a manuscript, and see where it's going. Like you always get interrupted. So anyway, so I was gifted these 2 weeks of residency, and I'm like, I'm just going to bang out this draft of my own love story. It's just going to happen. And I did the Hemingway approach, where it's like every day we write 500 words. It's just going to happen. Even if it's shit, it's going to happen. So it
Bang it
happened.
out.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, the going back and tying it to something, yeah, that's definitely a
Well,
challenge.
I find that I am often, and it's not just in writing, although often it spells out in writing and in many of the things that I'm working on. There is
Right.
something, whether it's an idea or it's something that's bothering me or it's the core of the story, that is right there in front of me and I'm avoiding it. It's I don't know I'm avoiding it, but I'm avoiding it. I'm, like, walking all the way around it. I did it in graduate school, I did East Asian studies, and I went into my advisor, and he looked at my schedule, and he looked at what I was doing. He says, "Why aren't you taking Japanese?" And I said, "No, I already had a little." "No, you're trying to get the graduate degree light. Go take this don't take the lesson, for God's sake. Just go do the hard part." And I that
Yeah.
was an incredibly important shut up and just look at the obvious thing and go do that. And over time, I have increasingly learned to do the hard part first. Sometimes that means I'm doing the hard part when it was completely unnecessary. But, that hard look at what's staring you in the face.
Hmm.
I'm still concerned about the circle and the line and how to
Yes.
turn that circle or usually concentric circles and over, the ball of yarn and turn it into a thread we can all follow.
Right. But you know what helped me there, and that's what I advise everyone who, reads my book or takes my classes, is it helps to have some thread, some focus, right? So when I was um, working on Jumping Over Shadows, I had this pile of family history, and all to me, it was all interesting. But for the actual story, it wasn't. So it quite often happened that, that something that I had done days of research for ended up being like 2 sentences, right? And that's sort of hard to give up, but that's part of learning to tell a story. Not everything that you know needs to be in the story, and a lot of the location research, for instance, that I did, I mean, it all began actually, my whole interest in the family history and how that resonated in my own life began with a visit to the Czech Republic that my brother and I did in 2002, where I was just like, whoa, like this place is laden with meaning for me. And why is that? Um, but I know the city very well now because I've been there a bunch of times, but in the book itself, it's not a character. So it helps that, I was there and I could describe certain scenes because I had been there. So I know, the street goes downhill and there are a couple of, there's actually one scene that I ended up taking out of the book that really sort of showcased the setting of where my grandparents used to live because it was right around the corner from a museum where Hitler came to speak during his tour in 1938. And I remember my grandmother telling me about that. So I had a whole scene about how Hitler came and the motorcade. I'd researched all of that. But in the end, that whole chapter about Hitler's visit wasn't really important to the story, so it had to go. So that's one of my
Hmm.
cutouts that I offered for, as a sort of bonus when people signed up for my newsletter back in the day. So that was one of the things where it was like, oh, I did all this research, but you know what? Like, mm,
The cutting room floor. The cutting room floor.
yeah,
Wow. And,
yeah, but that's part of what's important to tell a good story, but it's also what's good to bring the circle into a linear form, right? You need to have the focus. And I was like, okay, well, we're telling the love story of my aunt and what went down there. We don't need Hitler's visit. That can be a side note.
yeah, yeah. So the reduction, the, subtraction to find the
Mhm,
art.
mhm,
And, one thing that occurs to me is you have obviously such comfort and fluency. You've lived in this country for so many years, this cross-cultural fluency. Do you find yourself in the work that you've done, you're working on your dad's story now, right?
mhm.
That there are aspects of going back and forth as you think about who your audience is and the context and culture that they're representing that you bring into the work?
Yeah, of course. Like, I was very conscious of the fact when I was even when I wrote my children's book, which I'll hold up now,
Oh,
which
I
is the
love that.
latest.
There you go.
Um,
Love that.
so this is the story of my mother-in-law and how she survived the Holocaust as a hidden child in France. It's really a few episodes from her experience. But with all my books, but as the two, not the how-to book so much, but the memoir and the children's book, I was very, very conscious of the fact that my main audience is an American audience.
Mhm,
So I need to present everything in a way that makes sense to an American audience. And some of those are things that, even though I've lived in the United States for 38 years, if I'm counting correctly, it's been a long time. So I'm losing count. And my mother's American, so it's not like I moved to a foreign country, but there are things that, because I grew up between two, in Germany, traveled around a lot in Europe. Um, so I take sort of European German culture for granted, and I take American culture for granted. I don't necessarily pick up on what makes sense of one to the
yeah,
other. So that's where
yeah, yeah.
beta readers come in. Right? So, for instance, when we were developing the main character here, so
Mhm,
that's my mother-in-law, Natalie. Um, she she actually had very, very, very kinky black hair, and she wore it very short as a kid. Now, as a hidden child, you don't have sanitation or anything like that, so fleas were probably a big issue. So her hair was just really cut short. Now, I don't have pictures of her, obviously, during the time that she was a hidden child, because obviously. But I have a picture of her after the war in 1946, and she still has a very short hair, and she sort of has kind of a um, feature. She was already better fed. She wasn't as gaunt as she was as probably during that time when she suffered hunger. So with her hairdo in a black and white illustration, she looked like a little black girl.
yeah,
And so we were like, that's doesn't work, right, for this story. It
yeah,
just
yeah,
doesn't for an American audience. So, we ended up giving her this short bob because that was sort of a
yeah. Sometimes a cliché of
yeah,
a
but it was,
visual cliché is
I
the marker.
looked at, the kind of hairstyles that little girls had at the time, and that was pretty prevalent. So we were like, okay, we got to go with that. So those are the kinds of things that you have to take into account. Another thing was the story takes place in a village, and they were hidden in a barn, and the barn is smack in the middle of the village. And we had been to that little, it's really just a hamlet because it doesn't even have a red light. So we'd been to this hamlet, and I have photos from it, and I did a presentation to my illustrator who was in England, and to my book designer who was in Texas, to present them with sort of the real place, mainly for the illustrator, so that he would understand what it looks like. And he actually understood very well because he lives in the Manchester area.
Mhm.
And he was used to that sort of Normandy type architecture. But my book designer in Texas was like, when she saw the picture, she's like, now this makes sense to me, because she said it made no sense to me that the barn was in the middle of the village. Because in the United States, barns are not in the middle of the
Especially
village.
Texas, where everything is just it's like everything is big. It's very, very big. The distance,
Right.
let me just pop into town is an hour away.
Right. So that was one of the things that would never have occurred to me, because I grew up, in Upper Bavaria where, the farmhouses were in the middle of the village. So, it's not something I ever questioned, never would have questioned, even though I'm very conscious of the fact that in the United States, I'm in the Midwest and,
Yeah,
barns are out in the country, right? So
right.
that was it's just all these little cultural things that for me
Yeah.
are fun discoveries, but
Yeah.
when you're writing for a particular audience, you have to keep that in mind. And that's sometimes hard also when it comes to translations. I used in Jumping Over Shadows, um I used sometimes very little, but I did use quotes in German or Yiddish or Czech, because that gives a little bit of the flavor, but you can't
Mm.
overdo it, and it has to be carefully managed and all of that.
Yeah. 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 Wow. I want to interrupt for just a moment to our audience here. I'm having a technical issue in that I can't see any of the chat. I can't even tell for sure that we are live. You're telling me we're seeing the chat, so that's good. So forgive
Yeah.
me for not saying anything. I'm deeply delighted to have you here, and feel free to pop in with questions. And Ned, I'll defer to you to see.
Yeah, I mean, I can just see the messages coming in, so if I
Oh,
miss
I see.
something,
So
it's not a but
forgive
if I
my.
do see something, so I
Okay.
will
All right.
alert you.
Thank you. Thank you. For any of you out there watching, just grab a screenshot and send it my way, and then I can properly acknowledge people. That's my secret as to how I know who was here.
Yes.
But all of these, as I was describing to somebody just yesterday what it is that I do here with Project Ken. And I realized that a lot of I talk about, encouraging people to tell their stories in any way possible. And actually, some of the end of that really is telling your stories even if they're never published. Because I think the
Mm,
process of so many people here on Substack are talented writers, as you are, with some cases deep experience and MFAs and fancy life work as a
mm,
writer, and are now sitting down to write that book that's always been waiting in them, whether it's fiction or the nonfiction family history kind of stuff that a lot of us are doing.
sure.
And yet, we come in and talking about the story. I like to emphasize in the storytelling that it's not just about the written, printed prose. As powerful and important as that is, it isn't
Mm,
always alone just that. To my view, the very most important thing is that those around you hear the stories, that you understand the stories that your ancestors were living or even telling, because that's sometimes the case too. Um,
yes.
in our modern world, a book isn't just a book. You did the book, and then you did the book tour, and then you do the blogs, and then you do the out pieces, and then you do the live streams. In other words, that's a piece of a larger cluster of the story. Have you, especially as an experienced teacher, thought a lot about that? And well, obviously you have. You're thinking about these chapters, these giveaway chapters, these engagements, as we'd say in the technology
Right.
space.
Um, no, I'm not sure what you're asking me.
I'm asking you how you think about you've talked about the linearity of the
Mm,
published book, right? There is a craft to it in the way that if you were to write a haiku, you would know when you've started, you would have a pretty good idea of when you've declared it's done, and then it's done. If I build a website, if I build a software business, it is continually updating, it's continually changing. There is
mm,
a content there is a the line is doesn't just hit the paper and then you're done. It just keeps moving because of the interaction and the experience interacting with an
right,
audience, with a community. At least that's how I think of it. And I think storytelling in the sense of a body of stories, a morass, a miasma of stories is constantly, brewing around us. And as storytellers, we're constantly dipping into that and pulling out more. Am I not seeing it right? Am I crazy?
no, 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 no. I mean, my one of my big models is something is better than nothing. So I think that, and I'm a perfectionist, which is deadly to any project, but it's also good because I do finish projects. And you're the person who told me that when we're never done with family history, stop stressing about that. So that's very helpful to me because then I don't have to stress to get to that end with, putting together this, that, and the other. So that's an uncomfortable spot for me. But um, I do think that, what I'm currently doing with my siblings, we started sort of uh, looking into our father's sudden death, which was very traumatic to all of us. And, that grew into a bigger family project where we finally put together the family tree and stuff like that. And now we're, everybody's sort of dabbling in different pots that we all have on this big stove right now. So I think that the main thing is that, obviously don't discount videos. We dug up family movies from the Czech Republic from the 1930s. I mean, they blow my mind, to see my grandmother as a 24-year-old. And it's all, we have tapes that my dad, when he was a grad student at Purdue, that he and his parents, who were back in Germany, were exchanging, right? So we have this sort of like snapshot of him, wishing his dad a happy birthday and all that stuff. And talking about, different things that he experienced. So those are to me, oral history, or my brother calls it the audio archive, which
Mhm,
is, there's the visual archive.
mhm,
There's the oral history. My grandmother was a great storyteller. And so a lot of the family stories, some of which ended up in Jumping Over Shadows, because that was the oral history
yeah,
I grew up with. Right.
yeah,
So I think there are a lot of entry points. I ended up, because I'm a writer, I put stuff into books. But you're right. It doesn't have to be a book. I mean, my grandfather never published his memoirs, but he left a stack of typewritten, onion skinned papers. It's like an inch thick. I mean, that is a gold mine because I only basically used one chapter out of that. I read the whole thing, but what I needed for Jumping Over Shadows was one chapter.
I think that's a huge point because every one of us that are struggling with this getting it done, whether it's a personal struggle of get it done or somebody interrupted or a health issue happened and we did that chunk of work, but it didn't. A grandchild, a great grandchild can come along and use that as a starting point for where they're going to take it into a fantastic published memoir of the story to be told. Everything that we're creating, whether it's published or not, becomes the collection that is passed forward if we do our job right. And this is where the crime to me is when we selfishly decide that, I'm annoyed by my mother-in-law and she had that whole I am not, but if I were, I've heard this story. And I just took this pile of stuff and just got rid of it. And the got rid of it then ends up in thrift shops, all those found photos in thrift shops and postcards and whatnot that we find. Those to me are such heartbreak. It is such loss. I had a friend who was telling me the story, I blah, 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 family history, blah, blah, blah. It's a great intro.
Mm,
Everybody tells me their story. And she was telling me, "Oh, yeah, I don't have one."
mhm.
"Oh, yes, you do. Let's talk about that." And in
Right.
fact, the story was one of a grandparents' generation who experienced the internment camps here in the United States and felt shame about that experience and
Mm,
walled it off and would not talk about it. So,
yeah.
right there is an enormous story that is enormously important to later generations. So, in some ways, even the destruction of it becomes part of the story. And as we
Really?
know from researching, hey, even if you destroyed the evidence, there are pieces that are out there. and it's heartbreaking. The destruction itself is part of the story, and intimate details that give it resolution and character may be lost, and very hard to find. But oral history, memories, and then the artifacts that others have can be so compelling. I will include in the notes for this references to all 3 of your books, your wonderful books. Also, I wonder if you can send me the link to that piece that you used describing, you said it was an early post that you had about your grandmother's story about, Hitler's visit
Oh,
to the Czech Republic in
yeah,
1938. If it's
it's a
published.
PDF, but I can
Oh,
send you that.
well, send me references to it, or let people tell me where people can go to ask you for more information about that. Because the whole point here is the ways in which these stories intertwine. And as we wrap up, if you don't mind, I can't help myself. I want to give a little shout out to everybody that's been reaching out to me over the last 24 hours with the post that I did about migration stories.
Mm,
I think what is so remarkable about this is the ways in which all of our stories are weaving. Just as any one of us might be working through all the piles of materials that we have,
right.
what we're really seeing are the ways in which our stories parallel. And I'm not asking one person to tell somebody else's story, but rather to create an environment where they can find each other and collaborate as is helpful on resources and where they go. I was learning about, you probably know about the Jewish Public Library in Toronto,
Mhm,
some
mhm,
wonderful resources that are uniquely in Canada. For this kind of history, I was hearing about a fantastic new memoir published by some retired professors from here at Berkeley. Um, these kinds of things are just transformative, not only for you
mm,
as the writer, but for
right.
your descendants and maybe people you never knew. I think that's to me one of the most exciting parts.
Yeah, and I think, we never know what will become important to someone later on. It could be something so simple like, pictures that my dad, like tourist photos that my dad took when he took my sister up the World Trade Center. None of us would know, right, that that would become a historic thing because it doesn't exist anymore, right? It's become the symbol of such trauma in the United States. So, you never you never know what of all the stuff that we leave. So I think, for us it's important to have it labeled as much as we can so that people know where it takes place,
Excellent.
when it takes place. Um and whatever you leave I think might be useful.
Yeah,
It
I
might have meaning. And even, I think what's important to me also is, in terms of migration stories, like my family, because after the war, my dad's family, they were deported from the Czech Republic, or was Czechoslovakia at the time, to the German occupied zone, right? Like that changed who they were,
yeah,
and it changed the whole understand. Like they had a homeland, I didn't, right? My dad then married someone from another country. So, um, I think that those things made us who we are. Just like if you had a family that was interned, and even if they didn't talk about it, like it affected them. And
yeah,
how it affected them affects who you are,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Um, so I think that's part of what's so to me so compelling and so important. Because we can understand ourselves better, and I mean, it might be less traumatic things like figuring out that my mom's family comes from a family of Irish blacksmiths, which explains why my son has always been into metals. Like an 8-year-old soldering in the bathroom. I'm like, "Who is this person?" Like,
Did he know
that's
this
who he
story?
is.
Did he know this story?
Yeah, he eventually I'm like, "This is why, like, one of my great uncles had a manhole company in Iowa, like, everybody was working with metal. That's why you're working with metal."
I know. I have to say, the ancestry ad with the lederhosen and the kilt and, whatever it is, those ads, really hit a mark in that
Mhm.
sense that we're all somewhere looking for what is this thing that is about me, that is not like anybody around me, where does it come from? I mean, I have
Mm.
absolutely no fear of heights. I have to be kept down on the ground. Do not climb that ladder. And now I know that my great grandfather lived in Switzerland in generations in Switzerland climbing mountains. Oh, yeah. Now, was he
Exactly.
maybe he really was afraid of heights? I don't know that, but it gives me a story. It gives me a linearity to it that lets me hold on to something that lets me say, "Well, you see, I do belong here. This is true."
Yep,
Yeah, the
yep.
funny thing. Well, thank you so much for taking the
Oh,
time to
thank
do this
you. It was
today.
fun.
I
Always is
always
fun to
enjoy
talk to you.
speaking with you, and, your characterizations, the ways to tell these stories is so inspiring. I can see why you were such a wonderful teacher. I hope you just keep on keeping on, and,
Thank you.
I encourage everyone to make sure to be following your work, your pieces, because it's just been so inspiring, to all of us working our own little fields here, and trying to
You.
plant for the future. I guess that's where the gardening, reference is coming from. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Thanks for
And
having me.
anybody I didn't respond to in the chat, I apologize. I can't see you. Thank you. I know you're there. Talk soon, though.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Since I can't tell that it's live, I don't know how to stop it. I'll give it a try here. We'll chat further afterwards. Thank you again. Huh, damn this thing.